Welcome to MCLA and tonight's Green Living Seminar presentation. I'm Elena Traster, Chair of the Environmental Studies Department. As many of you know by now, this semester's Green Living Seminar is organized around the theme of sustainable food and farming. All presentations are free and open to the public. They take place on Thursdays at 5:30 here in the Feigenbaum Center for Science and Innovation, room 121. Today's presentation should last about 45 minutes with an opportunity to ask questions at the end. And just a couple of announcements before I welcome our presenter tonight. Tomorrow morning, the Northern Berkshire Community Coalition will be having their monthly forum. It will be focusing on moving towards sustainable living in North Berkshire. You're all invited to come from 10 to noon. It's at 85 Main Street, North Adams, at the Green. There's a flyer that I will leave up here if you'd like more information. Next week, we will not be meeting here, but I encourage you to come to the MCLA Undergraduate Research Conference mini-conference on food systems and food insecurity. We will be in Bowman, room 119, and the students in this class, along with other students in courses that have been touching on those topics, will be presenting on their research and service projects last semester and this semester. So if you'd like more information, come see me, and we hope we'll see you there. And finally, the last Green Living Seminar presentation for this semester will be on Thursday, April 25th, when Dorn Cox of Tuckaway Farm in New Hampshire. He is the co-founder of FarmHack and FarmOS. He's going to be presenting a lecture titled Innovating Open Source Technology for Small-Scale Sustainable Agriculture. So come back and join us then. Tonight's presentation on climate-smart agricultural policy in New York will be given by Julie Suarez, who's the Associate Dean of the College of Agriculture and Life Science at Cornell University, and we're so glad that you're here with us today. Thank you so much.
Good evening. How is everybody today? Good. Can you guys all hear me? Excellent. So I like to move around a lot when I talk, and I like to ask questions. So fair warning, do I have any farmers in the audience? Sort of. That's good. Oh, my sound is going in and out. Is that all right? Excellent. What do you farm?
Corn and soybeans.
Corn and soybeans. In the Midwest?
But I'm not the farmer.
I was going to say, you might be a little far from home.
I'm the non-operator of land.
Okay. So you're one of those people we hear about in the New York Times who get subsidy checks on occasion. It's nice to meet you. Any other farmers in the room at all? Okay, thanks. I just wanted to get a sense of a background. And so my presentation, and I'm again so happy when Elena called me to ask me to speak here tonight, just a touch of background about myself. I am not a scientist, so I'm Associate Dean for Government and Community Relations, and I work with a lot of really cool, amazingly smart people. The presentation that I have is solidly backed up by a lot of our data and a lot of our faculty members' expertise. It's all sourced. I can email it to you. You can see all the sources. I'm more than happy to make sure that you have data sources. If you have any questions as we go along the presentation, please just raise your hand at me. I've worked in agricultural policy primarily in New York State for about 25 years. First starting out in the New York State Senate Agriculture Committee as a director of that committee. And I worked for New York Farm Bureau for many years. I've actually worked with Massachusetts Farm Bureau, if any of you are familiar with that organization. Many, many years ago when we were battling for the Northeast Dairy Compact, many, many years ago. So you guys have a good Farm Bureau in Massachusetts as well. And now I've been at the Cornell College of Agriculture and Life Sciences for about 6 years. So after the background, what I'm going to give you is a little bit of a background on Cornell and our College of Ag and Life Sciences. I'm going to give you a little bit of a background on global trends that we're seeing in climate science. And I'm also going to give you some New York State and Northeast specific information. I apologize, I do not have Massachusetts specific information, but a lot of the data that I'm sharing is very, very similar and certainly very applicable to Massachusetts. And then I'm going to talk more about climate-smart farming policy so that perhaps you can apply some of the things that we've been doing in New York to your own state in Massachusetts. So with that, anybody have any questions, or I'll go ahead and start? All right. Maybe I'll go ahead and start. There we go. So Cornell University, people are probably familiar with Cornell University. We've been around as New York State's land grant for over 150 years. So most people know us as a private Ivy League institution headed in Ithaca. We also have a campus in Geneva, and we have a relatively new campus in New York City called Cornell Tech, along with Weill Cornell Medicine. Founded in 1865 with the really revolutionary philosophy of our founders, Ezra Cornell and Andrew Dickinson, who said they would found a university where any person could study in any study that they wanted to, which is very aspirational. At the time, Cornell was a secular university. We were one of the first schools to represent women, to admit women, and we've had a long history of diversity and inclusion. So I did want to talk a little bit about my college. What's interesting about Cornell is that it's not only a private Ivy League institution, it's also one that has a very public service-based mission. I talked about the fact that Cornell is a land grant. We're one of the few land grants that's also a private institution, but we're also affiliated with and very closely aligned and in fact part of the State University of New York system. I think your equivalent in Massachusetts is the University of Massachusetts, right? So we are a premier institution of scientific learning. Our goals and our aspiration in our college is quite simply to be life-changing. And our real goal is to make sure that we're finding science-based solutions for the grand challenges of the day in the food and farm system and environmental community as we see it. So we have a very heavy emphasis on extension and outreach. In fact, pretty much anything that you want to learn about in the food and farm arena, you can probably find some way to connect with it at Cornell. We have a great Cornell Small Farms program. You can just Google it. It'll pop right up. We do a lot of online training programs. Our most popular course right now, anybody want to hazard a guess? Most popular course right now for first-time farmers? Hemp? Actually, that's a really good one. We don't have an online course on hemp yet, but we're working on it. It's actually mushrooms, right? Mushroom growing is the big thing right now. And in fact, we just taught our first ever how to grow mushroom class in New York City. So mushrooms is an important commodity that we're seeing in small-scale farms and also increasingly our urban operations. Some of our other really popular operations are, anybody have an aspiration to be a cider maker, a brewery, a winery? Right? A lot of young people are coming back to their family farm. They want their own operation, and so we're teaching a lot of the next generation of farmers how to be winemakers and cider makers and brewers, and we have these wonderful one-day courses and certification courses. We have courses on soil health, we have master beekeeping, etc. We also have an extension system. I'm sure you have an extension system in Massachusetts. In New York, ours is the Cornell Cooperative Extension System. We have offices in every county. We engage with youth through our 4-H programs. We do a lot of nutrition education. We do a lot of financial literacy education for people who are food insecure. And we also offer, of course, agronomic services and technical advice to our farm community. So now that I'm done giving you just a little bit of background on Cornell and cows, I did want to talk a little bit about our field stations, research farms, and forest. You may be thinking to yourself, why in the world is this speech so Cornell heavy, right? Now I'm going to segue into the climate area and say that because our research stations and farms are all throughout the entirety of New York State, we see climate impacts on all of New York's diverse commodities and all the areas that we study. Right? Everywhere from Long Island, now I get to use the cool pointer thing. Everywhere from Long Island, we have extremely sandy soil agriculture down on Long Island. Many people don't know Long Island is one of our most agriculturally, I'm not saying this correctly. Long Island is one of our highest grossing agricultural areas of our state, right? Because they have very high value crops. So a lot of nursery, a lot of wineries, a lot of turf. So everywhere from the sandy soils of Long Island, we see climate change impacts up north. We have a lot of maple and forestry research up in the North Country. In the Finger Lakes area, we do a lot of grapes and specialty crops. We also have an organic vegetable farm at Freeville. And then, of course, out in Lake Erie, where we have the Concord Grape Belt. So climate change we're seeing in our research farms and stations in every area of New York State, in every commodity we produce. And I just thought that might be a little bit interesting to give you a sense of how vast and diverse our R&D is in New York State. So while we're known a lot for our agricultural research in our college, we also have a Department of Atmospheric Sciences. That Department of Atmospheric Sciences actually runs the Northeast Regional Climate Center. And if you tend to be obsessed with the weather, I'd highly encourage you to follow them on Twitter. They do a lot of excellent forecasting. That's run under contract with NOAA. And if you ever want to get a sense of what the drought forecasts are, and that includes the whole Northeast area, you can actually hop onto the NRCC platform. I share that with you only because a lot of the data and climate projections that I'm now going to transition into come from a lot of the data from our atmospheric scientists. So we have our climatologists and our agronomists working hand in hand to tackle the serious challenge of climate change in our farming community of today. So how many of you have heard of the FAO report or the UN reports that talk about feeding the future? A couple hands are going up, right? There's a whole host of different graphics you can use to illustrate this, but I thought it would be a good idea just to refresh everybody's memory. So this comes from the Association of Public Land-Grant Universities, and the data, again, is sourced from the last Food and Ag Organization report and the United Nations. So if we look at our population projections, we know that the global demand for agricultural products is really expected to grow significantly, right? By 2050, we're going to have to either double our food production and perhaps even slightly higher than double our food production if we're going to meet the estimated growing population of another 9 billion mouths to feed. So the thing that most people don't think about, though, is that when we think about doubling our production, we have to realize that this level of food production has to be achieved in the context of climate change, a lot of environmental challenges that our farmers are going to be facing in the context of more and more water demands, energy costs, and also issues related to the distribution, utilization, and of course, waste of food, right? So some really important challenges are ahead of us in our farm and food system, and we don't always think about these issues quite as much perhaps as we should in our current policy debates, particularly in our debates over climate change. So I wanted to share with you, and this map is a little bit, I think it's coming up a little bit fuzzy on your screen. This is a map from the World Development Report. What do you think the red and orange areas might indicate? This is showing global arable land. So I see a head nodding over there. What do you think? Red and orange, generally bad indicators, right? So this map is actually showing the projected changes in key climate variabilities that affect agricultural productivity. So the red and orange areas of our globe are really showing that in these areas we're going to see increased drought, we're going to see increased heat stress, increased temperatures, we're going to see increased soil erosion due to, at the same time as we have excessive drought, extreme precipitation, right? It's going to cause more and more soil degradation. And we're going to see a loss of productivity in general and a loss of agricultural yields. So this map is really a visual depiction of the challenges that our whole entire food system, not just in Massachusetts, not just in the Northeast, not just in the nation, but also in the globe, is starting to see. And so when we're talking about feeding a lot more people, we have to realize that we're talking about feeding a lot more people with a lot less land availability. One of the things that may pop into your minds too when you look at this is when you see the areas of the globe that are marked with red and orange, generally, what areas of the world do those correlate to? Might not have been a really well-phrased question. How are the economies of those red and orange marked areas? Not so good, right? It's generally less developed countries that are going to be the areas that are facing the least amount of availability of arable land. That's a significant challenge because they're also the population who is the less equipped through technology to deal with this, right? Research shows both at Cornell and other places, we have a faculty member named Chris Barrett. So if you're interested in this topic, Google Chris Barrett and a couple of his publications will come up. And he's actually connected that when you have large, less developed countries that are food insecure, that leads to political instability as well as mass migration, right? So some of the migration that we're seeing, did anybody read the New York Times this weekend? There's a big article in the New York Times about Venezuela and the failed state of Venezuela. And there's speculation in the New York Times that's saying some of the challenges that they're seeing in Venezuela and all the rural migration that's occurring is really because of climate change, because the climate in Venezuela and many of the rural areas has been so unstable, they've had a lot of failed harvests. I think it's probably too early to really sense that the data is out yet for that. But when we talk about political instability, when we talk about some of the challenges that we're facing around the globe today, a lot of it can be linked to climate change and its impact on agricultural production. So just something to think about as we go through this talk today. What's one of the single most important things that you can do for my gardeners and my farmers when you're growing plants? Water. Yep. 3 key ingredients: water, good soil or water if you're doing hydroponically, and light, right? Sun. This map is going to show you a little bit about water availability. And this is a really key thing to pay attention to, right? This is what gets farmers really excited, is water availability. So this is also why agriculture in New York, Massachusetts, the Northeast is really going to matter a lot more now and in the future when we're facing a time of impending different changes in our climate. This map shows a satellite-based estimate in the change of the amount of water stored in aquifers per year in the United States. Areas where the storage rate increased are shades of blue, where areas where water storage decreased are shades of brown. So that's an important thing to know. So most of the country, and this is real data, this is not a climate projection, and this is why I'm showing you this map, because I can show you projections too, but I think sometimes it's really important when you think about climate change to know what's actually happening now. And so when we put this map in an agricultural context, who can tell me what the nation's top producing agricultural state is? Excellent. Yep. California. This is, so the 2014, 2015, 2016 drought that California had, this map, this data comes from 2012. So keep that in mind. This is before California's bad drought. And California, during this time period, produces, I think they have 77,000 California farms. Even in 2015, the California farms produced 2/3 of the nation's fruits and vegetables. So that is a significant source of our food supply, is coming from California right now. Yes?
The shaded areas, aquifers, I recognize the Mcla in the center, shaded plains, but what are the other two in Arkansas and California?
This is all groundwater. So they are all aquifers. I can't give you the exact aquifer names, though. Yep, great question, but this is all groundwater changes. They didn't measure surface water at all. So Texas is the nation's second largest agricultural state, not a big surprise. It's got a lot of land mass, and you can see that's also showing some serious water stress. Iowa is our third largest agricultural state, and they're looking pretty good right now, so that's at least some good news, right? In Arizona, there are 2 counties in Arizona that produce 90% of the nation's supply of fresh winter lettuces. And those are counties in areas where they have severe drought stress or severe rates of groundwater depletion. Now remember, I said that this was done in 2003 and 2012 data. Just last year, a couple scientists at Cornell did a study of the California Tulare agricultural aquifer basin, the Tulare Basin agriculture area. And in that area, about 80% of the farms all rely on groundwater for their agriculture. And most importantly, the study, and this was just released this past year, the study showed that even though we had the break in the drought in California, and it helped alleviate some of the land subsistence, the aquifer recharge benefits were just short-lived, and it effectively didn't make a difference in the actual amount of groundwater availability in California. So even though the drought in California is broken, it still hasn't changed our storage capacity in California. So this is a really serious issue, and you may be wondering, why are you harping so much on California, right? And it's because putting climate change into an agricultural context, we all have to worry about the fact that the state that produces 2/3 of our fruits and vegetables is not going to have as much water as it does currently. And so technology will certainly help. UC Davis is a very good land grant. They're already working, and they have very smart farmers who are working on adopting all sorts of water-saving technology, also labor-saving technology as well. But the reality is that in this country, the Northeast will have a far more significant role to play in feeding ourselves in the future than we do right now. Because when we look at this agriculturally, here's New York, right? And as a New Yorker, I have to say we're looking pretty decent. Massachusetts, also looking pretty decent, so Massachusetts guys should be proud as well. In the Northeast, you can see we'll have water, and the rest of the country will not have the luxury of having as much water as they've had. So how will this impact us in the future? You can already see, fights over water rights increasing out in the far west of us. They just signed an interesting drought and water management agreement around the Colorado River. They're having lots of squabbles over management in California and Arizona, and we'll have to see how those shake out. But the question is, when I look at things from a policy framework, who's going to win the water battles? Is it going to be the farmer or the big cities in those states? It's probably going to be the cities and the residents, right? So that puts agriculture in our Northeast region in a position to grow. Somebody had asked a very wise question, and I can never pronounce the name of this aquifer, so I may ask you to do it. Ogallala, thank you. I think I stumbled through it. You know, this comes from the 4th National Climate Assessment, which was just released this past fall. And we used to say, when this country was founded, at least those of us who are New Yorkers born and bred, would say that, you know, way back 150, 200 years or so ago, we would say Schoharie County was a breadbasket of the entire country, right? But the reality is that our nation has settled, and, you know, many, many, many years later, we know that this area and this region is really the breadbasket of our country. I talked about California and the fruits and vegetables. Well, here we have agriculture in these regions depends almost exclusively on groundwater irrigation, right? Even more so than out in California. $35 billion regional industry and a vital source of food production. And the aquifer there is certainly facing the same difficulties as we're seeing elsewhere. So water is going to be a significant limitation for us in the future. Now I wanted to come back and bring this, and here's where I apologize. I don't have Massachusetts data, but I'm sure that this is fairly transferable to your state as well. But I wanted to talk a little bit about what are our projections. What are we seeing in New York? What do we expect to see in the future? And again, transferable into Massachusetts. So current data shows that from 1958 to 2010, the frequency and observed precipitation patterns, that's this map right here, increased by 71% in the entire Northeast. So that includes Massachusetts as well. So you might think, okay, you know, Julie was just talking about how water is scarce, so it's a really good thing we have this water. But if you're a farmer and you're sitting in a field and you get 2 inches of rain in an hour, what do you think that does to your soil and your crops? Yeah, it's a really serious challenge, right? So water availability in the Northeast is a blessing, and it will also, in a little bit, be a curse as well, right? So this, again, I want to point out, this map is actual data. This is real data. What we see here or what we see starting to go into here are going to be projections into the future. So the rate of increase in terms of the precipitation event in the Northeast is greater than any other area of the country. So you can see, again, the blessing and the curse that is our water increase in extreme precipitation. So about 1/3, this is kind of an interesting data set, about 1/3 of all crop losses to Northeast growers from 2013 to 2016 crop insurance claims came from claims from farmers for excessive moisture. During that same exact time period, the about 40% of those claims, crop insurance losses, came from drought. So this is really kind of unprecedented. If you're a farmer and you've been farming for 40 or 50 years, it's really, really rare for you to have seen 40 or 50 years ago. In one season, you go from extreme precipitation and extreme moisture, which causes difficulty in planting, causes difficulty in harvesting. Your tractors can get stuck in the fields, can't get out and work your fields appropriately. But in the same exact season, you could also have heat stress and drought stress for your crops as well. So this is a climate impact that we're seeing now. Projections show that over the next 20 years, the Northeast is going to have an additional 74% increase in precipitation events. So this is going to mean that our farmers are actually going to have to start thinking about maybe not so much being farmers, but also being water managers. In fact, I was speaking to a winery owner and a viticulturist in the Hudson Valley the other day, and she was telling me that she's now changing her job description. She's actually not calling herself a viticulturalist anymore or a winery owner. She's calling herself a water manager, because that's all she does now, is try to figure out how to mitigate and how to capture water. So let's talk a little bit about projections. Warmer day and nighttime temperatures are extremely difficult for fruit farmers, whether you're in New York or Massachusetts, particularly our tree crops like apples and our vegetable crops like broccoli. Where you have warm night temperatures, that kind of results in increased carbon losses from plant respiration, and that can lead to a decrease in carbohydrate accumulation, which in turn decreases the crop yields. When we look at future crop projections, and I picked an area for this purposes of Saratoga Springs, thinking that you guys would all have probably heard about the Saratoga Springs area in New York, particularly those who might like horse racing. And so in Saratoga Springs, we've looked at our region there. Instead of our current baseline in the summer of about 10 days over 90 degrees, in the 2050s, we're going to have as many as 22 to 50 days in the summer that are over 90 degrees. So that's a really significant change. And that is, of course, assuming that our current temperature increases continue. So and all this data, by the way, if you're really curious about this, you can actually Google ClimateAid, CLIMAID. It's right here on the top of the PowerPoint. This is a report that was put together by our New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, or of course Northeast Regional Climate Center in Cornell. It's a really good chapter on agricultural impacts. So if you're interested in that, it might be an interesting reading source for you. So what's next for New York and the Northeast farmers? So now that we kind of have a sense of what we're facing and where the climate trends are, let's talk a little bit about what New York farmers can expect. Now, bear in mind, I want to preface this by saying this is a land-grant consensus. This is the consensus of our faculty members. It's a consensus of our extension experts who are actively working with farmers. It's not necessarily a consensus of what farmers are feeling right now. So I wanted to make sure that you knew that. So when we look at challenges, climate instability we've talked about already, right? From early season warm-ups to late frost. So if you have planted a perennial orchard, right? Trees, vineyards, and all of a sudden you're in the first week of March, and you and I might be walking down the streets of, MCLA's wonderful campus, because it's gorgeous here, thinking, oh, this is great. I don't have to wear my jacket. It's, 70 degrees out, and it's the first week of March. I love climate change. It's wonderful. But what do you think is going on to the apple trees and the grapevines? They're starting to get confused, right? They're starting, maybe if you have a prolonged warm-up, they start actually to bud out. And then, of course, is our weather going to stay the same? Is that warm? No, it's not at all. So then you see a frost, and then you see very significant crop loss from early season warm-ups and then late frost. So I wanted to point out that those types of issues are really, really hard for farmers to deal with. Water management I've talked about already, right? You go from excessive moisture in the spring to excessive drought in the summer. And then, of course, this past year, we saw a lot of excessive moisture when farmers were trying to get their crops in and also plant their cover crops. So increased pest and disease pressure, an increase in the amount of invasive species. We're also seeing, and this is just emerging in the research right now, so I wanted to point this out, but scientists in both the US and actually in China have started really looking at what happens when we have increased CO2 levels in the atmosphere to our plants and to our plant health. And at first you kind of think, well, intuitively, hey, this is great. You have more CO2, plants need CO2. It does cause increased plant growth. But what's really fascinating is that not only do we see increasing weed pressure, we're also seeing increased plant canopy growth, but not necessarily an increase in the nutritive value of those plants, right? So the plants are expending all their energy growing the green leaves, but they're not necessarily growing the vitamins that we need to consume and feed ourselves. So again, this is just kind of emerging research. Then we've talked about soil degradation as well. But because I'm kind of always a glass half full type of person, I think we also have to talk about the opportunities that are ahead of our food and farm system today. So we will have water in the Northeast, right? A huge, huge plus of certainly in New York State and the rest of the Northeast. In New York, and again, I'm not sure about Massachusetts, this is New York data. In New York, we've added 5 more growing degree days over the last 10 years. So if you're a gardener and you'd really like to change your plant hardiness zone, you can now plant more ornamentals and they'll survive for longer. If you're a farmer, what this means is we have farmers in the north country of our state actually growing 2 different crops during the summer. This was unheard of many, many years ago. So there are some advantages. From our perspective in New York, we're close to a market of about 119 million eaters. So this is good for us, and also there's reduced carbon miles because we are local and we are close. I think we have a good ability to start thinking about double and cover cropping. At Cornell, we're doing a lot of research right now and actually just released our first version and are working on a winter version of a winter barley and a spring barley plant, right? And we're working on perennial crops so that we could start planting grains like kernza, which we haven't actually really eaten or consumed that much. I am told it does make good beer as well. but so you can actually grow a perennial crop year-round, which would actually cut down on our carbon footprint. We're also working a lot on soil health BMPs, or best management practices, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. And of course, we have excellent R&D resources. Obviously, I have to plug our R&D resources at Cornell, but MIT also has a great program as well with Caleb Harper. Yep.
Just want to point out that heat is not enough for many plants. They need sunlight.
Absolutely.
And they're disconnected with climate change. You get the heat before you get the sunlight that you need. And so, it's not quite as rosy, I think, as you're painting there. And that many plants might come out and they're like, wait, no sun. Sorry.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Bear in mind, I don't think climate change is rosy. What I'm trying to point out is that there are opportunities we have to consider as well. Because certainly when I look at the map overall in food production in the globe and in the state, there are a lot of reasons to be very, very seriously concerned. Yeah. 119 million eaters, people eating food. Sorry, my own little, yeah. So we have a really good market to market to, right? So natural climate solutions. Has anybody heard of this term before? Because I wanted to talk a little bit and segue into some policy. So natural climate solutions is a publication that was released in the Journal of Science Advances. I do have the citation right here. Peter Woodbury was our Cornell Callis faculty member who was engaged in it. It was a really good national partnership with both the Nature Conservancy, scientists from all over the country. There's probably somebody from Massachusetts on it. I don't know myself. But we had representatives from Cornell, UC Davis. We had a lot of good academic advice on that. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of a background, and then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this policy framework that's talking about how do we mitigate greenhouse gas emissions through using more naturally based climate solutions. So just a couple quick pointers, because I think it's good to have a frame of reference. CO2, or carbon dioxide, accounts for about 80% of global greenhouse gas emissions. I think everybody generally is familiar with that. What people are not always as familiar with is that methane and nitrous oxide are actually the primary agricultural emissions. Those are the ones that we're really concerned about in an agricultural context. And here's why. The methane impact on the atmosphere is about 34 times more potent than CO2. And nitrous oxide is about 298 times more potent than CO2. So we're very concerned about methane and nitrous oxide, as well as, of course, carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. Now, when we look at the IPCC report in 2014, they estimated that global greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture alone are about 20%. In our country, greenhouse gas emissions nationally, so again, this is US only, from ag are about 8%. And this is an EPA analysis from 2016. Greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture in New York are about 2% of total New York State emissions. But interestingly enough, while we're 2% of greenhouse gas emissions in New York State, methane emissions from ag are about 15%. So that's a lot higher methane emissions. Anybody's going to tell me why our methane emissions in New York are higher? Dairy, yep. Yep, we have a wonderful dairy industry, and we've become a lot more efficient over time, but methane is an issue in dairy production. So we need to think about that in context, and when I talk about natural climate solutions, these are 21 different ways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions with improved management of our agricultural areas, our farms, forests, and also wetlands, right? So using our natural environment to be more thoughtful in terms of mitigating our greenhouse gas emissions. We're probably not going to convince everybody to stop driving their car right away, right? But we can take some steps using our natural environment to help mitigate our impact on greenhouse gas emissions. So nationally, this group of scientists found out that we can reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 21% if we all adopted natural climate solutions. And that's the equivalent to all vehicle emissions in this country at the current moment in time. So what are natural climate solutions, right? Because it sounds a little bit outlandish at first glance to be saying you can use natural approaches to help mitigate climate change. And this is not the sole answer to climate change. Be aware it's just one piece of it, right? So when we talk about natural climate solutions, we're talking about things like biochar. Has anybody heard of biochar before? Okay, So if you Google pyrolysis kiln in Cornell, up will pop a really cool video that I couldn't actually capture and embed in, but here's a little screenshot of it. So those of you who want to go online and Google pyrolysis kiln in Cornell, you'll see this kind of cool little video about what biochar is, and it's basically a solid charcoal-like material. You form it by heating biomass in the absence of oxygen, right? And it's not really a fertilizer, it's a charcoal-like substance. That's probably the best way to describe it. But it helps both boost fertility because it improves the water capacity holding in soils, and it also, most importantly, helps sequester carbon, right? So you can actually take carbon out of the atmosphere and store it in the land as a carbon sink. So that's a really important feature about biochar. And that's something we now have a pyrolysis kiln in Cornell. We're actually doing a lot of R&D on this topic right now, actually looking at how do we take dairy manure, put it through the kiln, turn it into a biochar system, and naturally return it to the land. So that's one practice. When we talk about returning carbon to soils within this framework, we also have cover cropping, right? Everybody knows what cover cropping is, right? So I'm getting a lot of heads nodding. Yep. So cover cropping in New York State, I don't know Massachusetts percentages, but in New York State we have one of the higher percentages of adaptation of cover cropping at about 17%. But 17% is still not 100% of our farms, right? It's a really important goal to look forward. If you're thinking about this from a policy perspective, Maryland has a Chesapeake Bay incentive program, and in Maryland, almost all of their farmers are actually cover cropping now because they're receiving some incentives from the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Quality Improvement Program to actually help them adopt to cover cropping systems. And cover cropping is great because once you kind of first start learning how to do it and adopting this technique, it actually can help you increase your yields and increase the farm's bottom line. So we also have no-till adoption, right? Fewer and fewer passes on the soil with your tractor will really help significantly reduce soil compaction and also, of course, reduce CO2 emissions. Then we're also talking more about composting and manure. A lot of people are using the term regenerative agriculture, right? Returning carbon to the land. We're also talking about legumes and pasture land. Improved grazing, improved crop nutrient management, really, really important when we talk about nitrous oxide emissions. What's the single best way to reduce nitrous oxide emissions on farms? Anybody take a guess? You're a Midwestern crop farmer, so I would say nitrous oxide is probably more important to you, which is that if you reduce your fertilizer usage on farms when you're growing your crops, that's how you can really get a good handle on reducing your nitrous oxide emissions. Really important to do something called precision fertilization, right? Only applying what the plant needs for the time that they need it and not over applying. So better forest management and forest regeneration. Regeneration of our forest in New York, and I'm sure in Massachusetts, is a significant challenge right now, largely because we have wonderful four-legged predators named deer who like to overbrowse our forests, right? And so we're having a lot of challenges in New York and probably in Massachusetts with forest regeneration. And it's really important that we have our forestry resources serve as good carbon sinks as well. We're talking a lot about using urban reforestation as well, helping plant more trees in urban environments for a whole host of different benefits. And of course, we can't forget wetlands when we look at natural climate solutions. Really important to manage our wetlands with tidal wetland and seagrass restoration as well. So now that I've talked a little bit about climate solutions, I want to talk to you a little bit about implementation, and specifically what is New York doing. And so under Governor Cuomo's leadership, who's really been doing an outstanding job when it comes to climate change and really has been a significant leader in this space, we have what's called a clean energy standard in New York. Do you have an equivalent in Massachusetts? I'm not sure. We have our New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. I see Elena's nodding her head. Yeah. Okay, yeah, no, it makes sense. So our clean energy standard is adopted by our Public Service Commission, and our goal is to get to 50% renewable energy by 2030. You know, we also partner in this Northeast initiative, which I know Massachusetts is part of as well, called RGGI, or the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. Our governor has set a really ambitious target of having 100% carbon-free electricity by 2040. So we have a lot of work to do in New York State, and it's really a wonderful challenge to undertake. We've made a lot of investments to solar. So here I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our implementation strategies. New York State is actually the 10th fastest growing state for solar installations, largely because of New York Sun, which is an initiative that helps give people a little bit of financial incentives to afford solar. We also have the 76 West competition, which is trying to get at this issue of climate change and energy technologies in a little bit different way, trying to incentivize innovation, right? So this is really important because we don't always think about this. You know, how do we incentivize companies to come up with better battery storage systems, with better clean technologies? And so that's the 76 West competition. And there's a disclaimer, I will say, that Cornell actually helps run this in concert with NYSERDA, and it's in the southern tier of our state. We're also really starting to talk about workforce emergence. So how do we train the next generation of clean technology workers? And this is an emerging initiative in New York State. It's not quite as well developed yet, but NYSERDA has just started to release some really interesting platforms telling about developing training institutes for the economy of our future and helping to support students. We have a lot of student internships available right now in clean technologies. We also have something called the Clean Energy Bank financing. From an agricultural perspective, this is important because the Clean Energy Bank has actually been financing a lot of CEA operations in New York State. So CEA stands for Controlled Environment Agriculture, so larger greenhouse operations that are getting behind the season or getting around the seasonality issue and are establishing operations, and they're receiving some financing from the Clean Energy Bank. And so if you ever want to do something really fun, Google greenhouses from space, and you'll see this marvelous image of this incredible bank of CEA facilities actually in Portugal. And they supply, I think, the bulk of the European Union's fresh fruits or fresh agricultural produce. So we also have a Clean Energy for Ag task force. So in New York State, we're very focused on helping our agricultural sector. And I happen to serve on the Clean Energy for Ag task force. And this is one of the partnership projects that has resulted in this is an initiative called Glaze. So if you Google Glaze, you'll find out we've formed a partnership at Cornell Cows with a bunch of different lighting companies, a bunch of different controlled environment ag operations, and RPI, which is our Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, with their engineers. And what we're trying to do is develop better LED lighting systems that will really help encourage plant yields in greenhouses while reducing our energy costs. So that's kind of a cool new technology tie-in. New York State has also been one of the leading states. In fact, Governor Cuomo was one of the leaders in forming the U.S. Climate Alliance. The U.S. Climate Alliance, I'll talk about AM in a minute, is a network of about 23 different states. I think Massachusetts is in it as well, but I'm not 100% sure. You can find out on their website. And so their goal is to help, now that the U.S. is no longer in the Paris Agreement, the goal is to help try to implement the Paris Agreement goals, although outside of the structure of the federal government. And so one of the key points is that they formed this natural and working land strategy after the publication of the Natural Climate Solutions. And so every state that's committed to joining the U.S. Climate Alliance has to do a first step, which is to inventory their natural lands, both their farmlands and their forest lands, to figure out, okay, these are the resources that we have. If we model certain best management practices, how much of our greenhouse gas emissions can we reduce? And so we're now in this first step now where Cornell Cows, our College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, and also SUNY ESF, which is our Environmental School of Forestry, are in partnership working together to conduct this inventory for our state. It's pretty exciting. So we'll have to see how, again, we can implement the natural climate solutions in New York State. So that's a little bit on our policy section. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about our agriculture environmental management framework, because I would argue, of course, I do have a New York bias. I keep that, right? And in New York, we've really been doing a lot with the farm community in terms of improved environmental management. We've been doing this for a long time. So we have what's called an AEM framework, and this is a voluntary statewide program that actually works on a watershed basis, but it's very focused on individually customizing certain specific environmental practices that suit each farmer's needs best. This was originally created in the early 1990s. The reason we did this was actually to protect water quality. At that time, the biggest environmental challenge on our farms was really thought to be water quality. We were concerned, our watersheds in the southern tier and the Finger Lakes, a lot of them drain into the Chesapeake Bay. We were concerned about high levels of nitrogen and phosphorus, right? So that's why the AEM framework was established, and Cornell spent a lot of time working with our soil and water conservation districts, which I'm sure you have soil and water conservation districts in Massachusetts as well. We have a 5-tier process, which involves a series of different worksheets that farmers go through. If you're interested in learning more, the website is right there on the bottom of the slide, and it's a really unique, cool process that's easy for a farmer to use, and that's the most important thing. So of the 5 tiers you go through, and first you inventory your farm. When we first started this program, one of the most common things that we found is that a lot of farms had gutters on their barns that were simply running into their farmyard and carrying manure off their barns area and into nearby streams, right? And that was the biggest, probably one of the biggest environmental challenge we had at that time in the 1990s. So you inventory what's going on your farm, you document what you have, you develop a plan, a conservation plan for how to ameliorate any negative environmental externalities, then you implement, and then you evaluate. One of the most important steps you can do in running any type of policy program, and we don't do this often enough, is actually to evaluate whether it's working, right? Because we have tendency to throw a lot of money into brilliant ideas at the time, but then we don't ever stop to think whether or not we've actually effectuated any changes. So, you see my money signs on the side, right? Do farmers have a lot of money to make improvements to their farms? Not often, right? It is a really low margin business. It's really difficult to be a farmer financially very, very often. So probably one of the single biggest incentives that this program has is that if you participate in the AEM process, it's voluntary, but there's also funding available. There's about an 85 to 90% cost share to farmers that will help them make the environmental improvements that they need to benefit all of New York State, and arguably anybody who lives downstream of New York State as well. So why did I spend so much time talking about this? Not only because it's a great program that we have in New York, but also in 2008, way before we really started talking about climate change, we amended the program to include greenhouse gas emissions and air quality. So the main focus is still water quality, but even back in 2008 in New York, we were starting to focus on mitigating greenhouse gas emissions in agriculture. And a lot of what we did in 2008 and beyond from the AEM program is actually work with our dairy farmers to put cover systems on manure lagoons and also to flare methane, right? It's a good way of dealing with some of the methane challenges we have. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about climate resiliency farming. So the climate resilient farming program is almost brand new in New York State. This started in 2015. So I guess it's not brand new by now, but it's still pretty new to us. And the goal of the Climate Smart Farming Program is really to reduce the impact of agriculture on climate change, so that's mitigation, and also to help farmers to adapt. We've talked about the many challenges farmers are going to be facing with climate change. This program is also an adaptation program. How do we help our farm community in the face of different challenges? So since 2015, we've spent about $5.1 million for 40 different projects that are helping about 70 farms. So these numbers may seem a little small. Some of the projects are pretty big. Again, that cover and flare system can be a pretty expensive system. But some of the improvements that we've been doing have also been helping farmers with soil health practices, so helping them get established in cover cropping. So these are the areas of focus, methane reduction, water management, and soil health improvements. In this year's budget, we actually doubled the funding that will be available to farmers in 2020. So it's a really exciting new program we have. I hope you have something similar to that in Massachusetts. I did want to take a moment and talk a little bit about methane, because we've talked about methane already in the context of it being a very difficult greenhouse gas that we need to figure out a better way to address. So one of the things that Governor Cuomo did is in 2017 or 2016, he directed all the state agencies to really come together and establish what's called the New York State Methane Reduction Plan. And you can find this as well right on the website, and there's a site for DEC. And so our Department of Environmental Conservation was one of the primary drivers of this program. It covers a lot of different areas. For us, I'm going to focus just on the agricultural concepts, which is that goals are methane reduction, cover and flare, and I'm going to explain what the CNCPS system is. So has anybody ever worked on a dairy farm? Somebody's smiling. You've worked on a dairy farm before. So it's my contention that dairy animals are probably the best fed of all of us, because their diets are so wonderfully well balanced, right? So at Cornell, we have this system called a Cornell Net Carbohydrate and Protein System. It's actually basically a feeding model. So you can actually go right online, you pull this site up, you actually type in, what your herd size is, what your capacity is, what your goals are for your animals, what you want for your milk yield, what inputs you have, and it spits out this nice TMR or a total mixed ration that'll tell you exactly what you need to feed to your dairy animals to achieve your goals as a farmer. Now, this system is very widely used. In fact, I was on a dairy farm in South Africa, and they were using this system. So we're kind of surprised sometimes by the depth of its usage in the ag community. But in about 2-3 years ago, we actually put in a new model in the CNCPS system, which is called the methane reduction model. So if you're a farmer, you're putting in your milk yields, you're putting in everything else, you can also now check a little box effectively that says you want to manage your cow's dietary intakes in a way that helps minimize their methane production, which is kind of funny. I realize we keep talking about cow farts as if it's really a funny process, right? But it's really important to think about how you can use good animal diets to help reduce the methane in the first place. And what we've seen in New York State is that through using a bunch of different strategies, the dairy industry in New York State has decreased our methane production by about 25% over the past 15 years. So that's a really good science-based statistic to know, is that we can actually make very positive changes. We can also actually adjust the protein. So this research just came out of our college, and if you decrease the protein slightly, you can also see a nitrogen reduction in the manure that you're applying to the fields. So that's also really exciting. And then, of course, when we look at methane reduction plan, one of the goals is to also increase manure storage covers and flare systems. I talked about that a lot. Those are hugely expensive, but really important to do. One of the other things we're working on in New York that's ag-related for methane is utilizing our AD systems, which are anaerobic digesters. So we have about 25 or so on our farms today in New York State. Not high penetration of our anaerobic digester systems, but in our most recently adopted state budget, we actually did a ban on food waste, we actually are requiring more organics recycling now by large food scrap generators. And so if you're really interested in looking at a digester, it's a Synergy Biogas. It's actually out in Western New York. It's a Noblehurst dairy farm, all Cornell graduates, I'm happy to say. They have a large dairy operation, and then they also have an anaerobic digester, and they've partnered with Wegmans and a variety of other facilities. So they're recovering food waste, putting that into their anaerobic digester along with their manure, putting more electricity onto the grid, and helping manage our environmental systems a little bit more. So that's what I'm talking about when I talk about utilizing AD systems more efficiently. So that's a pretty exciting new goal. So from a Cornell Cow's perspective, what are we doing to help meet the grand challenges of the day? We just formed something called the Institute for Digital Agriculture. I talked about precision feeding. When we look at trying to double food production at a time of great environmental change, we know one of the ways we're going to get there is through new innovations and new technology. And so our Institute for Digital Agriculture, you can find it right there. It's a collaboration between 5 of our different colleges at Cornell, and we're really hoping to create the innovations that are going to carry us forward. We also have a soil health and resiliency project that I'm quite fond of. Again, working with the farm community. Last year we did outreach to about 3,000 farmers on the importance of soil health. We hope to do more. We've talked about precision feeding systems, nutrient management, right? How do we manage our manure much better? We're also talking about plant breeding. You may recall I talked a little bit about how do we increase the nutritive value of plants at a time, how do we make sure that our plants are going to be able to grow and to thrive in a changing climate and to be more adaptive to increased water stress or extreme stress of too much water. And again, cover cropping and organics, and I talked about our glaze project. So with that, that's it for me. I appreciated the time. I think if not at the end, I think I probably talked a little too long. I apologize, Elena. Happy to take any questions, and I'm happy to stay after for a bit if you'd like as well. Thank you.
probably for one question from the audience now, and then we can take Julie on her offer to have some folks come down and interact here individually. Is there anything you wants to?
Yes.
Did you tell us how to make a cow make less methane?
You change their diet.
Yeah. Can you be a little more specific?
I can give you the academic citation if you'd like, and you can read that. But effectively, it's a mix of you reduce your protein intake and you increase certain ingredients in the cow's dietary ration. So it's a paper by Larry Chase and Tom Overton, and I can't give you the details right off the top of my head, I'm sorry. But it's an excellent paper to read, and I'll be more than happy to send it your way. It's pretty fascinating stuff, right? You wouldn't have thought that you could change diet or methane quite that much by changing diets.
Thank you again. Please join us next week for the mini conference, and then the week after that for our final presentation. Thanks so much for our speaker tonight for